Maeve Linwood tossed the folded note directly into the fireplace and watched the corners turn black before the flames took the rest. Charles Brooks had written it with the kind of casual disregard that only people with money could manage, informing her that his engagement to Lydia Hayes would be announced that very afternoon at the Appleby summer party. Maeve did not shed a single tear, nor did her hands shake as she watched the paper crumble into gray ash within 30 seconds. 2 years ago, such a betrayal would have left her weeping on the floor until her ribs ached, but today she simply felt a clean, quiet sense of relief. She went upstairs to change into her best dark blue cotton dress, which she had mended carefully at the sleeve, pinned her hair back without looking in the mirror, and told her mother she was heading to the party to face the town. The Appleby parlor in the coastal town of Newport, Rhode Island, was crowded, warm, and thick with the scent of expensive flower arrangements that cost more than the Linwood family spent on groceries in a month. Newport high society had gathered to fan themselves and laugh at things that were not funny, simply to prove they belonged to the wealthy inner circle. Maeve took a small glass of lemonade from a passing tray and stood near the window, choosing her ground deliberately rather than hiding from the whispers. She spotted Charles Brooks across the room, standing at the center of a laughing crowd, with his hand resting on Lydia's expensive green silk dress. Charles noticed her, walked over with a glass of bourbon, and loudly remarked that it was a long summer, and she should not lose hope of finding a husband. The surrounding guests let out a low chuckle, while Lydia pressed her lips together to hide a smug smile. Maeve kept her voice perfectly level as she congratulated Charles on his engagement, refusing to let his public performance break her composure. Charles smiled with a bored sort of satisfaction, calling her a sensible girl, as if she were a sturdy pair of winter shoes rather than a human being. From her left, old Mrs. Gable spoke just loudly enough for the circle to hear, commenting on how the Linwood family land was heavily mortgaged, and it was no wonder Maeve remained unmarried. Maeve turned directly to her and replied that the gossip about her father's finances was greatly exaggerated, but invited the older woman to continue talking if she enjoyed rumors. Charles laughed easily to break the sudden tension, but his eyes turned cold for a single second before he turned back to his new fiancée. Maeve remained standing by the window, her jaw set, refusing to be the one who fled the room in shame. The heavy sound of carriage wheels on the street outside broke the hum of conversation, followed by measured, unhurried bootsteps on the front stairs. The parlor doors opened, and a sudden silence fell over the guests as a tall man stepped into the warm room. Gideon Cole carried himself with the quiet authority of a king, his features striking and completely distinct from anyone else in Newport. He had stark white hair that fell neatly around a remarkably pale face, and dark eyes that catalogued the room with absolute precision. He wore a simple dark coat without any expensive ornamentation, yet the hostess, Mrs. Appleby, nearly tipped over a side table in her haste to welcome him. Gideon gave her a brief nod, stating he only had brief business nearby, but his eyes immediately moved past her and stopped directly on Maeve. Gideon walked through the crowd, which adjusted around him the way a river moves around a solid stone, until he stood directly in front of Maeve near the window. He addressed her by name in a quiet, certain voice, completely ignoring Charles, who was watching with the sharp alertness of a man who knew he was outranked. Maeve met his dark eyes without flinching, asking if he was acquainted with the hosts, to which he replied that he had only come because he was told she would be there. The surrounding guests grew completely silent, watching this mysterious, white-haired man ignore the wealthy elite to speak with a woman they had just written off. Gideon offered his arm and stated he wished to speak with her in private, and Maeve, calculating nothing and deciding everything, placed her hand on his sleeve. They walked out into the hot, quiet garden, leaving behind the heavy silence of the parlor and the sudden collapse of Charles's public performance. Gideon stopped at a respectful distance, looking at her with a direct, assessing gaze that carried no false politeness. Maeve told him that he did not have to make such a public statement across the room, but he simply replied that the gathering provided the perfect opportunity for his purpose. She studied his pale features, noting that men of his immense wealth did not walk across crowded rooms toward ruined women without a clear reason. Gideon smiled slightly, acknowledging that her observation was correct, and stated that he had come to make a specific proposal that would serve them both directly. Gideon explained that he required a wife to manage his vast household and properties in Providence, Rhode Island, having watched her handle her father's difficult tenant accounts over the past year. He noted that she thought in clear systems, did not panic under social pressure, and did not require constant flattery to function properly. Maeve stood quietly for 5 seconds before stating that he was proposing a business arrangement rather than a romance. Gideon nodded, calling it an honest arrangement where she would have full authority over his northern properties without any interference. In return, he promised to clear her family's heavy debts, secure her father's land, and provide her with an independent annual sum that would remain hers regardless of any future circumstance. Maeve asked why he did not choose a younger woman without her family complications, since a man of his position could have his pick of any wealthy family. Gideon replied that he did not want a typical high society wife, but rather someone who had already walked through hardship and emerged with a clear mind. He stated that her ability to remain unbroken by the town's cruelty was far more valuable to him than a spotless reputation among gossips. Maeve requested time to consider the offer and insisted on seeing every single term written down in a formal document before signing. Gideon told her the papers were already prepared for her review, and Maeve realized he had been entirely certain she would ask for them. She told him that if she accepted, it would be a rational decision based on sound terms, not an act of desperation. Maeve spent 4 full days thinking about the proposal, not because she was confused, but because she wanted to give the decision its proper weight. She walked the northern boundaries of her family's land in the early morning, while the dew was still fresh on the grass, looking at the fields her father had worked for 30 years. The land was slipping away from them steadily, like dry sand through a closed fist, and she knew they could not survive another winter without help. In the evenings, she sat across from her father and noticed how much thinner his arms had become since the previous autumn. He had a small hitch in his breathing that he tried to hide with a cough, and she pretended not to notice, though the sound filled her with a quiet dread. She weighed the reality of a life built on a written contract against the slow, painful ruin of remaining unmarried in Newport. Gideon Cole had promised her no affection, but he had offered something far scarcer in her experience, which was absolute honesty and genuine respect. On the 4th morning, Maeve sat at her father's old writing desk, dipped her pen in the ink, and wrote 4 short sentences to the white-haired man. She stated that the terms were acceptable, provided he agreed to 3 specific additions regarding her father's medical care and tenant protections. Gideon's reply arrived that very afternoon, containing only 5 words telling her to name the additions and that he would see her the following morning. They were married on a quiet Tuesday in late July at a small stone church just outside the town boundaries. The ceremony was short, attended only by her father, 2 local witnesses, and a minister who kept his remarks brief and free of unnecessary sentiment. Maeve wore a simple gray dress instead of traditional white, refusing to perform a joy she did not yet feel. Gideon wore a dark wool coat that made his pale skin and white hair stand out in the dim light of the church. He spoke his vows clearly, without any artistic flourish, the way a man speaks when he means exactly what he is saying. Afterward, her father held both of her hands in his trembling palms, asking if she was truly all right with this sudden choice. Maeve assured her father that Gideon treated her honestly, which mattered far more to her than the empty promises Charles Brooks had given her. Her father nodded slowly, having lived long enough to understand that a reliable partnership was worth more than romantic words. The carriage journey to the city of Providence took 2 days of steady travel through the green summer countryside. Gideon spent the first afternoon reading through commercial shipping contracts, working with a focus that seemed entirely unaffected by the rocking of the vehicle. Mid-afternoon, he handed a stack of correspondence to Maeve without any introductory small talk, suggesting she might want something to occupy her time during the long drive. The documents contained the latest business letters regarding his real estate holdings, and Maeve began reading them with her usual sharp attention to detail. By the third page, she found a poorly written clause regarding liability for property damage that clearly left Gideon vulnerable to dishonest tenants. She folded the corner of the paper and handed it back to him, pointing out the specific vagueness that could cost him money. Gideon read the section carefully, remained silent for a long moment, and then took out his pen to correct the error in the margin. They did not speak again for the next hour, but as Maeve looked out the window at the passing fields, she noticed the heavy knot of worry in her chest felt slightly lighter. The Cole estate in Providence was a massive 3-story brick house, surrounded by high iron gates and shaded by thick elm trees that kept the grounds surprisingly dark. The house felt more like a grand institution than a family home, staffed by 14 quiet servants who moved through the hallways with practiced efficiency. Maeve stood in the main study on her first morning, looking at a massive household ledger that was so disorganized it looked like 3 years of random receipts tossed into a drawer. The previous housekeeper had used a creative system that failed to balance properly at the end of every single month. Maeve felt a familiar spark of usefulness return to her as she pulled up a chair and began sorting through the chaos. The head housekeeper, a solid woman named Mrs. Harding, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the new mistress work with a look of quiet curiosity. Maeve pointed to a linen purchase from the previous spring, noting that Gideon had been charged 3 times the fair market rate for basic supplies. Mrs. Harding explained that the master did not typically concern himself with the market price of household goods, leaving such details to the merchants. Maeve replied that he would concern himself with them now, and within 7 days, she had restructured the entire accounting system. She renegotiated terms with their 3 main food suppliers and dismissed a kitchen assistant who had been collecting double wages through a convenient bookkeeping error. Gideon watched these changes without offering a single word of criticism or praise, spending his daylight hours sleeping in his private quarters and appearing only after sunset. When they crossed paths in the evening or sat across from each other at the dinner table, he listened intently to her daily reports. He never touched the roasted meats or vegetables the servants prepared for her, keeping only a crystal glass filled with a deep red liquid at his side. Maeve noticed that his hands were always ice-cold whenever he passed her a document, and he moved across the hardwood floors without making a single sound. Despite his strange nocturnal habits, he treated her with a steady deference, never making a household decision without consulting her opinion first. After 3 weeks of this quiet routine, Gideon placed a letter on the breakfast table next to her cup and announced he had to return to Newport. He explained that a wealthy family was disputing a piece of land near the harbor, and he needed to handle the matter in person over the course of 4 days. He told her she was entirely free to accompany him or remain in Providence, leaving the choice completely to her own judgment. Maeve thought of the gossips in Newport and the smug satisfaction Charles Brooks had shown during their last encounter. She looked up at Gideon and told him she would come, and he simply nodded before returning to his letters, accepting her choice without demanding an explanation. Newport in late August was thick with heavy heat, the dusty streets smelling of coastal salt, horses, and the growing shipping industry. By Thursday morning, Maeve had received 3 calling cards from wealthy women who had completely ignored her existence for the past 2 years. She set the cards on the side table in the order they arrived, understanding perfectly well that they had only come because she was now married to Gideon Cole. She received the visitors politely in the front parlor of their rented townhouse, pouring tea and listening carefully while saying very little herself. By the time the 3rd visitor departed, Maeve had gathered a complete picture of the current political rivalries and financial anxieties gripping the town's elite. That evening, she sat with Gideon in the darkened library and shared the specific details she had learned from the town gossips. She explained that the Gable family was losing money on their shipping investments, and that 3 separate women had dropped hints about a new federal banking law. Gideon paused his writing and looked at her with a sharp intensity, admitting he had been trying to confirm the timeline of that specific banking law for 2 weeks. He asked how she had managed to get 3 different high society women to reveal such valuable financial information during a simple tea visit. Tuve smiled, explaining that she had simply asked about their husbands' business ventures, as people rarely guard secrets when they assume the listener cannot understand them. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, a strange expression moving across his pale features that seemed to sit right at the edge of absolute admiration. He remarked that she should have been managing his business meetings for the past 10 years, and Maeve Practical replied that he should have asked her sooner. On their 3rd evening in the town, they attended a formal dinner party hosted by the wealthy Whitmore family, a gathering filled with local merchants and politicians. Maeve wore a dark green silk gown that was simple but perfectly tailored, staying close to her husband without acting like a decorative ornament. She was discussing the southern cotton trade with a group of women when she heard a familiar, loud laugh across the crowded room. Charles Brooks was standing near the fireplace, with Lydia on his arm, holding court with 2 local politicians, while holding a glass of imported bourbon. Lydia noticed Maeve first, her expression freezing in surprise, before she quickly forced her face into a stiff, polite mask. She whispered something into Charles's ear, causing him to turn his head and lock eyes with his former fiancée. Charles's face went through several rapid changes, moving from smug warmth to sudden confusion, as his eyes drifted to the white-haired man standing right beside Maeve. Gideon was currently deep in conversation with 2 of the most powerful politicians in Rhode Island, his striking presence completely dominating the corner of the room. Maeve did not smile or glare at Charles. She simply met his gaze with the steady, calm look of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to prove. Charles looked away first, shifting his weight uneasily and steering Lydia toward the opposite side of the crowded room for the rest of the evening. It was well after midnight when the carriage brought them back to the quiet house on the edge of town, where the servants had left the lamps burning low. Maeve sat in the front parlor to remove her shoes, expecting to feel a sense of triumph, but finding herself feeling only a quiet pity for the girl she had been 2 years ago. She realized she no longer cared about Charles's opinion, because the smallness of his world had become entirely clear to her. Gideon stepped into the parlor doorway, having removed his heavy traveling coat and necktie, looking surprisingly tired in the dim lamplight. He noted that she was still awake, and Maeve admitted she was thinking about how small Charles Brooks seemed to her now compared to her memories. Gideon walked into the room and stood near the window, stating that Charles had never been worth her fear then, and was certainly not worth her thoughts now. Maeve looked at her hands, remarking that knowing a truth in her mind was quite different from actually feeling it in her heart. She looked up at his stark white hair and pale skin, asking him exactly how long he had been watching her before he made his proposal in the garden. Gideon turned from the window and stated clearly that he had been observing her for 8 months before he approached her with the written contract. He explained that he does not make important decisions quickly, and that he had been watching to see if the town's cruelty would make her bitter or afraid. He noted that most people broke under the pressure of financial ruin and social isolation, but she had chosen to remain clear-headed and practical every single day. Maeve admitted that she had considered giving up many times, but Gideon replied that choosing to fight despite that temptation was exactly what made her uncommon. Her throat tightened at his words, as no one had ever acknowledged the silent struggle she had endured for the past 2 years. Gideon asked if she was genuinely content with their current arrangement, and Maeve answered honestly that she felt useful and no longer had to apologize for her intelligence. However, she added that she would not lie and claim it was the romantic life she had once imagined as a young girl. Gideon nodded in agreement, stating he preferred her blunt honesty over the empty flatteries he usually received from the humans he dealt with. He asked if the arrangement was enough for her, and his dark eyes held her gaze for a remarkably long time, revealing a hint of something deep and ancient behind his gaze. He told her to ask him that same question again in 6 months, leaving her with an answer that was far more intriguing than she expected. They returned to the Providence estate the following morning, the carriage ride passing in a comfortable silence that felt entirely different from their first journey. Mid-afternoon, Gideon handed her a thick folder regarding a complicated land dispute on the Hudson River that had been tangled in court for 40 years. Maeve read through the old deeds carefully for an hour until she noticed a glaring discrepancy in a witness signature from the late Revolutionary War. She showed the page to Gideon, pointing out that the witness had actually died 2 years before the deed was supposedly signed in front of him. Gideon looked at the paper, his voice flat, as he noted his expensive lawyer had missed this basic factual error for 3 consecutive months. The Hudson land case was resolved completely in Gideon's favor within 11 days, after the opposing lawyers realized their primary deed was entirely fraudulent. Gideon informed Maeve that his lawyer had been desperate to know who discovered the signature error, and that he had proudly told him his wife handled the file. Maeve remarked that they should let the man assume it was a stroke of luck, but Gideon insisted he wanted his associates to understand her true capability. By the time September arrived, a new routine had formed between them, in the grand, quiet house, with Gideon including her in all his nightly correspondence reviews. They sat together in the study after the servants retired, working by the light of a single green lamp while the rest of the city slept. One morning, Maeve flagged a series of letters from their southern trading agent, pointing out that the man was quoting 2 different prices for the same cargo. She explained that the agent was blaming increased shipping costs, but her own review of the harbor records showed that shipping rates had remained completely flat all summer. Gideon looked at her across the desk, asking how she had obtained the latest harbor records without leaving the estate grounds. Maeve explained that she had simply asked the housekeeper's nephew, who worked on the Providence docks, noting that useful information always lives with working people rather than formal offices. Gideon picked up his pen and drew a dark line through the agent's name, writing the word "replace" in the margin. Gideon stated that she deserved a formal salary for this valuable business work, as it went far beyond the original terms of their household agreement. Maeve reminded him that she already received a generous allowance, but Gideon insisted they renegotiate the contract to reflect her role as his true business partner. They signed the amended document that afternoon, with Maeve reading every single line twice to ensure the legal language was completely airtight. Later that week, Mrs. Harding set a cup of coffee on Maeve's desk, remarking with a knowing smile that the master watched her constantly whenever she was occupied with the ledgers. Maeve kept her hand perfectly steady as she turned the page, replying that their relationship was strictly professional, though her heart gave a strange, unexpected flutter. The reality of how deeply she had fallen into this attachment became clear on a chilly Thursday evening in October, after Gideon returned from a 4-day trip to Boston. Maeve was sitting at the library desk when she heard his familiar, silent step in the hallway and his low voice speaking to the footman. She tried to keep her eyes on the shipping report in front of her, but she found herself reading the exact same line 4 times, without understanding a single word. Gideon appeared in the doorway, looking pale and weary from the long journey, and sat in the chair across from her without his usual formal coat. He asked if she was well, and Maeve looked up, her voice dropping as she admitted that something had fundamentally shifted in how she viewed their arrangement. Gideon sat completely still, asking what kind of shift she meant, and Maeve explained that she had not accounted for these growing personal feelings in their original contract. She told him she was still working out what to do, as she had been terribly wrong about her feelings for Charles Brooks in the past, and did not trust her own judgment. Gideon leaned forward, his white hair catching the firelight, and confessed that he had spent his 4 days in Boston thinking of nothing but returning to her side. He stated that after centuries of building wealth and influence, She was the first person who made him want to build a real future instead of a mere structure. He assured her that she had not imagined his attachment, speaking with a flat, absolute certainty that made her breath catch. Maeve met his gaze, stating that she needed time and continued honesty without any social pressure to ensure her feelings were completely real. Gideon agreed immediately, but his expression turned serious as he pulled a letter from his pocket that had arrived from a young politician named Thomas Gable. The letter claimed that the Gable family had discovered severe legal irregularities in the old Linwood land deeds, suggesting her father did not legally own his farm. Maeve went entirely cold with fury, recognizing the move as a coordinated act of social revenge because she had embarrassed old Mrs. Gable at the summer party. She told Gideon that the land had been in her family for 40 years, but admitted there might be an old survey note from 30 years ago in her father's desk. They left for Newport 2 days later to examine the original family papers before Thomas Gable could make the dispute public and ruin her father's fragile health. Gideon sat across from her in the carriage, offering no empty comforts, but promising they would dismantle the threat together, using the strict letter of the law. He remarked that he knew her sharp mind would find the answer before anyone else in Rhode Island even thought to look for a mistake. Maeve smiled at his confidence, and for the very first time since they met, Gideon let out a genuine, warm smile that made his pale face look remarkably human. She turned to look out the window to hide her blushing cheeks, feeling a fierce determination take the place of her anger. They arrived at the small Linwood house to find her father looking frail and thin, his coat hanging loosely from his narrow shoulders as he welcomed them inside. Gideon shook her father's hand with a deep respect that clearly comforted the old man, and they immediately set to work in the small study. Maeve found the old survey notation 20 minutes into her search, a single folded page from 30 years ago containing a private agreement with Lydia Hayes's grandfather. The note described a small strip of shared land that the two neighbors had agreed to leave unrecorded based on a simple handshake. Maeve realized that Thomas Gable had somehow discovered this old note and was planning to use it to create enough public doubt to force a financial settlement. Gideon explained that an unrecorded boundary agreement had absolutely no standing in a modern court of law, but Maeve noted that Gable only needed to create a public scandal to damage their reputation. She realized that someone within their own inner circle must have leaked their travel plans to the Gable family, as Thomas had filed his legal inquiry remarkably fast. Gideon's jaw tightened as he revealed that his longtime lawyer, Mr. Finch, had been seen meeting with the Gable family's attorney the previous week. Maeve advised him not to tip Finch off until they had secured the land records, insisting they must visit the Providence Land Registry office before the inquiry was formally logged. Gideon looked at her with a look of pure pride, agreeing to meet her downstairs at 6 o'clock the following morning. They stood outside the Brickland Registry building at 6:45, waiting in the biting autumn air until the grumpy clerk finally unlocked the front doors. Maeve laid her documents on the wooden counter, including the original 40-year-old deed, the full survey, and her own 3 pages of written legal analysis. The senior registrar, an elderly man named Mr. Hobart, looked over his spectacles in surprise at a woman presenting such a detailed property argument so early in the morning. Gideon sat quietly in the corner, deliberately letting Maeve lead the conversation, to show the officials that his wife possessed full authority over the matter. Maeve cited Section 14 of the Registry Code, proving that Thomas Gable had no direct legal interest in the property and therefore lacked the standing to file an inquiry. Mr. Hobart checked the thick law books, shook his head in surprise, and agreed to hold the Gable inquiry in review, rather than logging it into the public record. This strategic victory bought them the time they needed to handle the betrayal within their own household, without causing a public scandal in Newport society. As they walked out into the morning sunshine, Gideon remarked that he was thoroughly impressed by her knowledge of the local registry codes. Maeve smiled, explaining that she had spent the previous night reading the law books while he was resting, as she took her work quite seriously. Gideon stopped on the cobblestone street, looking at her with an intensity that made the surrounding city traffic fade into complete silence. He confessed that he had officially received confirmation of Lawyer Finch's betrayal that morning, discovering the man had been leaking his business schedules for over a year. Maeve stated that they must dismiss Finch immediately and review every single contract the man had touched during his employment. Gideon replied that he had already found a far superior legal counsel, looking directly at Maeve and stating that she was the only person he trusted completely with his affairs. The plainness of his words settled deeply into her chest, dissolving the last lingering doubts she held about their unusual relationship. She fell into step beside him as they walked back to the carriage, ready to face whatever the wealthy families of Newport planned to throw at them next. The review of the old legal files took 3 full days of constant work, with Maeve and a trusted clerk named Mr. Cross sitting at the library desk until the candles burned down to the wood. They discovered that Finch had been passing secondary intelligence to the Gable family for 8 months, helping them time their financial pressures to coincide with Gideon's business trips. Maeve explained to Gideon that Thomas Gable was heavily in debt after his Western shipping venture failed, and that he desperately needed a quick cash settlement from the coal estate to clear his own bills. On the 4th morning, Mr. Hobart's official letter arrived from the registry office, confirming that Gable's fraudulent inquiry had been completely rejected due to a total lack of legal standing. The legal threat was gone, but Thomas Gable attempted to save face by spreading malicious rumors through the tea rooms of Newport, hinting that Maeve's family land was completely ruined. Maeve listened to these reports from the housekeeper, decided she would not let the whispers linger, and told Gideon they must attend the upcoming winter assembly together. She explained that they needed to show Newport high society a picture of complete unity and financial strength that would render Gable's rumors completely irrelevant. Gideon agreed, and as he stood close to her in the quiet study, he confessed that his cold nature had finally found something he truly wished to cherish. Maeve reached up to touch his pale jaw, promising him that they would walk into the grand ballroom as true partners in every sense of the word. The Whitmore ballroom was filled with 300 wealthy guests in their finest silks when Maeve and Gideon arrived together, precisely on time. Maeve wore a magnificent deep green silk gown that fell in clean, elegant lines, her mother's old pearl earrings catching the light as she moved through the crowd. The entire room grew quiet as they entered, the guests observing the absolute confidence in Maeve's posture and the steady, protective way Gideon stayed at her side. Within an hour, Maeve had engaged 3 prominent merchants in conversation about the northern shipping trade, sharing insights that left them thoroughly impressed by her sharp intelligence. Thomas Gable appeared near the long refreshment tables, his face turning dark as he noticed how easily the town elite were receiving the woman he had tried to ruin. Maeve excused herself from the conversation and walked directly toward Thomas Gable, her husband stepping into place right beside her with his usual silent grace. She greeted Gable politely, asking with a sweet smile how his Western land application was progressing, knowing full well that his creditors were preparing to seize his remaining ships. She remarked that a failed registry filing looked terribly poor on a politician's public record, advising him to be far more careful with his legal judgments in the future. Gable's jaw tightened in fury, but he found himself completely frozen under Gideon's cold, unblinking gaze, which carried the unmistakable promise of complete financial ruin if he spoke another word. Gideon quietly dismissed him with a brief nod, and Gable turned on his heel, fleeing the ballroom before the dessert course was even served. As the carriage brought them back to the Providence estate, beneath a canopy of cold winter stars, Maeve looked at her white-haired husband and realized she felt a deep, enduring peace. She thought of Charles Brooks and the painful wreckage of her past, realizing that those hardships had simply been the hard ground from which she built her current strength. She had not been rescued by a romantic prince. She had been seen and valued by a mysterious, honest man who treated her as his absolute equal. They sat together in the front parlor as the fire burned low, their fingers interlaced in the quiet darkness of the old house. The long winter was ahead of them, but Maeve knew that the partnership they had constructed out of plain truth and mutual respect would easily hold against any storm the world might bring. Looking out at the quiet gardens as the first hints of spring began to touch the brick walls of the estate, I felt a deep sense of stillness that I had not known since my youth. The fields in Newport were secure. My father's health had stabilized under the care of reliable doctors, and the books for the Providence properties balanced perfectly to the very last penny. Newport society still talked about us, of course, but the whispers had changed from pitying scoffs to a quiet, respectful curiosity about the woman who managed the vast coal fortune with such a steady hand. I watched the morning light filter through the tall library windows, catching the silver strands of Gideon's hair as he worked quietly at his desk, completely unbothered by the growing brightness of the day. We had not built our life on the fleeting emotions of a traditional courtship, nor had we relied on the grand promises that men so easily break when circumstances change. We had started with a plain, honest contract signed on a summer afternoon, and from those cold lines of ink, we had grown a deep and unshakable understanding that required no public performance to prove its worth. I realized then that the true value of a life spent together did not lie in the dramatic declarations of romance, but in the quiet, everyday choices to face reality side by side, without flinching. As Gideon looked up from his papers and met my gaze with that familiar, undivided attention, I smiled and walked over to join him at the table. The future stretched out before us, long and uncertain as the changing seasons, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges came next, we would handle them exactly as we always had, one honest step at a time.